Welcome to Hebrew Bible Insights, a podcast about making sense of the Hebrew Bible. I'm Matthew Delaney, and I'm here with Dr. Nathan French. We're so excited for our episode today because a few episodes ago, in episode 53, we talked about Dr. French's amazing experience in Israel, getting a master's degree there. What a dream of an education to get. And today we're going to talk about his PhD experience, something that most people in the world don't have. And I think we'll get to learn a lot of wonderful things about the value of education and learning, and whether or not you have advanced degrees or not, I think we'll all get something out of today's conversation. So, Dr. French, it's great to have you as always.
Yeah. Good to be back.
So when did you know that you wanted to get a PhD? When did that idea first cross your mind? What was your inspiration?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it was sort of a journey, I think, in discerning the calling of wanting to become a teacher and to become a professional academic and to be involved in academia. I remember even in high school when I did my senior project, I had to write a paper, was in a class with an English teacher there, and really enjoyed just doing research and writing, even at that level. And though when I came to ORU, I was actually sort of on a different trajectory. I ended up switching my major to theological and historical studies. And I think it was during that time, being mentored by the professor that was over that area during that time, that I really began to discern the want to move into academia. Also had the privilege of being an honors assistant for a hermeneutics course here at ORU when I was an undergrad for the Old Testament professor that was here at the time, and then as well was discerning during that time, getting to help with that, getting to lecture for one of the classes, just knowing that. This was something I could pursue and wanted to pursue, and thought it would be good. But I think as far as the PhD, it was when I was a grad student here at ORU, doing a year of the master's program here, especially in Dr. Brad Young's program. I know that he was very influential with regard to me wanting to choose that path. Also being in Lenore's class, as you know, being trained in Hebrew under Lenore Mulliken as well. That Israel was sort of the place I wanted to go in order to do Hebrew Bible. I just knew that, as we talked in a previous episode. But for the purpose of making that step in order to then be able to find a PhD program after that. That was sort of during that time. So it was really from undergrad to grad where I really began to discern that, maybe being a professor, being in academia and teaching, I know that these giftings are very much a part of who I am and my calling. It certainly wasn't how do I want to say it? You don't just jump into academia and say, you know what, this would be a very good lucrative career for me, or this will be a real moneymaker. That's not the decision you make when you're going this path. But when you're discerning a calling and you know that you do have the giftings for that and you want to be a teacher, it's for me anyways, it was much more of a journey, and really began to make those decisions sort of at the end of my undergraduate and beginning of my graduate career. But once I got to Hebrew University, it was very clear, yes, this is the path I want to go, and I definitely want to continue forward in it. So
I think a couple of Lord of the Rings references are perfect here. One does not simply walk into Mordor, and you could say one does not simply walk into academia.
Right. It's very true. So, even after getting the master's degree, and I had many friends and colleagues. I would say even very talented, very brilliant friends and colleagues who haven't gone on to get PhDs because life is life, and you just have to make that decision of whether or not you want to go through with it, and whether or not you think it's worth it on the end for your family and all of that. Yeah. So, but you're right, it's one of those things. So.
Yeah, by the way, I hope, the goal of the tone of this conversation, as with all of our episodes, is remembering that we are the body of Christ. I've been reading through 1 Corinthians recently, and it's important that we remember the importance of unity, and that, we have the head, the feet, the organs, all different parts of the body that serve together. Yeah. And not everyone's going to follow the same path. No. But I was just talking with a pastor this morning about First Corinthians, what are his insights? And one of the things that he mentioned is that people don't realize when we look at the sections of First Corinthians that talk about spiritual gifts, we might isolate that and think, oh, cool, teaching's about spiritual gifts. But forget that part of the context is that the Corinthian church, amongst many problems they had, was they were very divided within themselves. Yeah. And so some of the context is about unity. Yeah. So anyway, we all have different backgrounds and we have different life choices and scenarios that happen. But how do we take advantage the best that we can of the gifts and callings that we have? And obviously you've been called by God to go as far as you can into academia. And as someone who knows you, the knowledge that you gain from that journey is something that's so valuable for people like me. You've been a huge impact on my life when it comes to how I think about scripture. And you've been that for so many students. And I hope anyone listening to this podcast today feels encouraged in the same way, that wherever God's called you, there is a reason for that. Yeah. And we can trust God in that.
That's fantastic. I'm glad you brought that up. And that's why I'm trying to frame it more in the calling aspect, because it just requires that. And for me in my journey, that just was the case. It was a calling. And it's been a fun and fantastic journey. But definitely the calling, and then making the decision. Yes, this is the path that I need to go. But I must say, thankfully for my professors at ORU, I mean, they really steward that well. Even if you're not really being upfront with them about it, that this is where you want to go, they can still discern and help you in discerning that particular calling. So my ORU profs were fantastic with that. And then my Hebrew U professors were just the same. Very, very willing and ready to help their students find the program that would be best for them. So,
yeah. I wanted to make one other Lord of the Rings reference. Sorry to people who don't know about this. It saddens me that the vast majority of my students have not watched Lord of the Rings. It hurts me deeply. But the first book is The Fellowship of the Ring. And I can't help but think that when you talk about your inspiration for PhD, you give names and people. And I resonate with that deeply. I think if you ask me about any part of my life and you want me to tell my story, I can't do that without saying the names of people. Yeah. So I think that this, in a way, it's almost like discipleship. Yeah. I think that this rabbi to Talmud, or this rabbi to disciple relationship in, classical Judaism, it emphasizes the relationship component. And so I think that we can all resonate with people who they don't just give us information, but they actually know us in a deeper way, and they form us through how they model life and the wisdom that they give.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. Absolutely true.
So, all right, with your PhD, one other kind of preliminary question is, where did you get your PhD? What was your PhD in, and what was your dissertation topic?
Yes, so I completed my PhD at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. It was in divinity with the emphasis in Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern studies, and it was on the topic. Well, okay, so the title of the dissertation, of course, we did a whole episode on this, but we have new listeners. Maybe they haven't heard the episode. So the title of the dissertation was A Theocentric Interpretation of Hadat Toverah, the knowledge of good and evil as the knowledge for administering reward and punishment, which is a ridiculous title nonetheless. But it does frame exactly what I'm trying to do in that work. Genesis 2:9, of course, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The humans, when they eat of it, they receive a divine knowledge of some sort, and scholars are not quite clear as to how to interpret the phrase Hadat Toverah, the knowledge of good and evil, in order to tell us what the knowledge of good and evil is. So it's a very fantastic, very fun, I think, conversation when you get deep into the scholarly literature, which is what I do in that dissertation. And so my topic really... it was on that on one level, but then it was also sort of an exegetical study of Toverah, good and evil in Hebrew, throughout Genesis, the Deuteronomistic history, and then, of course, other parts of the Hebrew Bible as well that I just bring into the conversation. So had to look at the retribution, ancient Near Eastern studies, all around good and evil, in order that we can try to interpret Hadat Toverah in a better way, or at least I think in a very good way with the proposal that I made. So,
Yeah, I highly recommend people go back to episode 24. What is the
Mhm.
tree of the knowledge of good and evil really about? An
Mhm.
interview with Dr. Nathan French about his PhD dissertation. Fun fact, this is before you became my permanent co-host.
Yes, that
Uh,
was, wasn't it?
yeah,
First
so
episode.
that was a fun episode. You can also look that up on YouTube. In fact, that's our most listened to YouTube video, not including the shorts that we do on YouTube, but that's the most listened to one. I get people listen to that every single month. I keep getting notifications. People love that content. And I should say, this is kind of a side tangent, but I was listening to a podcast yesterday while I was working out where a scholar was talking about connections between wisdom literature and other narratives in the Hebrew Bible. And one of the connections that she makes is to Genesis.
Yeah.
But she admits that it's a little confusing and, well, not confusing, but she says it's noteworthy that in books like Proverbs, wisdom is depicted as something that you should want and you can search and you should take. Whereas in Genesis, this tree is depicted as something that you're not supposed to search and take. And she sees there being maybe not a contradiction, but there's definitely a rub there. Like, how do we make sense of this?
Totally.
And I thought to myself, oh, this makes total sense to me why the wisdom in Proverbs is something you search, whereas in Genesis it's not. Why do I know this? Well, because of Dr. Nathan French and his dissertation. Because this isn't the tree doesn't just represent wisdom in general. It represents something very specific within the ancient Near East worldview and in the theology of the Hebrew Bible. And I'm like, oh, makes total sense to me. So.
Yeah, it's great. Well, I'll have to send her my book then, maybe.
Yes,
I find some money to buy it. So,
yeah, right. So let's go start. I love starting big picture. That's helpful, at least for me. So I wonder if you can give us what's the big picture process of getting a PhD. What does that kind of look like? The 30,000 foot view.
No, that's great. I think to start, what you need to do is find a good graduate program to be a part of. And that graduate program needs to train you on all levels toward which you want to take the PhD. So, for example, I mean, we have a lot of PhDs in Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and of course, students are going to be involved in different areas of that discipline because there's so much, as you know, as you're talking about the wisdom literature alone, you can get a PhD in the wisdom literature. Well, if you're not well trained in the wisdom literature or you haven't been stewarded in that in your graduate work, it's going to be hard then, I think, in your PhD work to go that route. You can, but nonetheless, you need to find a good graduate program that can ground you well within the discipline of Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern studies specifically, since, I mean, that's what I'm saying for a PhD. But on a larger scale, I'm sure that's true of all disciplines, that the preparatory work that is needed to go that direction, I think is very important. So that would be number one, is to make sure that within your graduate program that you are a part of, that you are preparing yourself to go that direction. Because what's on your transcripts, the classes that you've taken are ultimately what's going to lead you toward that path. And the program that you're into really does matter. But more so, I think the sorts of classes that you've taken is really what matters. That makes
a lot of sense. I think maybe even using the literal word for that graduate program is a master's degree. And so ideally you become a master of that subject area so that you can, if I'm hearing you right, so that you can use those skills you've mastered in the dissertation project. Absolutely,
precisely. And of course, you need to have it on a general level, yes, for your discipline, but then the specifics as well, that you know sort of well the topic area that you want to go in. So for me, with the knowledge of good and evil, that was an easy step because in my master's program, I had dived deeply into the research of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I thought, okay, there's something here, and I think this is worthy of a dissertation. Some don't think that regarding the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but others do, and I certainly did. And I thought this would be great to do as a whole project because in the midst of doing the research, there wasn't one thing I could go to really get a nice overview of everything. I had to go to journal articles and to commentaries, and I had to really sift through so much of the research to really begin to get a really big picture of what the scholars were saying regarding this. And so therefore I thought, okay, this is definitely worthy of a dissertation. And then to bring in what I saw was missing was the key. But I discovered that in my master's program. So for me, that was very important. And I think Hebrew University, just because, they bring you to those, that program for me brought me to that level in order to think about engaging with the research there. So that would be step one. So with the master's degree. Step two, you got to find the program you want to be a part of. And ultimately this means, with whom do you want to write your PhD? Because it will come down to having a PhD advisor over your work. Now, obviously we got to talk about the programs all over the world of which you can be a part, but there's a marketable difference between, for example, the place where I did my dissertation in the UK, than say doing it in the United States. So the programs are different on one major level, and that is that when you're doing a program in the United States, you are often thrown right into sort of another master's degree, which is preparatory work for your PhD. You're probably getting to do some good teaching at that time as well. And then you have your comprehensive exams, and then you move into the writing of your dissertation. Whereas in the UK, sometimes they require maybe a 1-year master's degree that you can begin writing a master's thesis that might then become part of your dissertation. So you're sort of moving into the writing of the dissertation pretty quickly in the UK, which their focus is much more on the writing aspect. So if you have a master's degree or you have 2 master's degrees and you feel very prepared to do a PhD, then the UK might be a fantastic option for you if you're ready to just sit down and write on this topic and to research, because the programs there are very good at stewarding you in the writing and the publishing realm and the research realm. So they're just very good at that. So I think that's sort of the second level. You've got to decide where you want to do it, what style of program do you want to be in, and then, of course, like I mentioned, the advisor. Who is it with whom you want to work on this PhD? And for me, I had been searching and looking at the different programs in the UK, and I came across the work of Professor Lena Sophia Tiemeyer, teaches at Örebro School of Theology in Sweden. She's professor of biblical studies there. But was at Aberdeen when I was there as reader in Hebrew Bible, and she was her profile as far as her degrees. She had completed her first 2 degrees at the Hebrew University and then completed a PhD at Oxford. It was especially the Hebrew University. I knew that we would share some of the same methodology in that degree training, which I really wanted. And 2, I just loved her research, loved all the publishing, loved how she could write and the brilliance that is within that writing. And then I met her at an SBL meeting in Boston. That was it. She was fantastic. So really engaging, really fun to work with. And I know we're going to talk about this a bit more regarding the role of the PhD advisor, but that is key. You need to find someone with whom you want to work. That's very important. Someone who is specialized in your area, in your topic area, and can handle the research that you will be doing.
That's excellent. Yeah, one of the things that many people probably know, but some might, is also how project oriented the dissertation is. Yeah. I'll use my wife as an example. She's a doctor, and I know some people are very familiar with the process of what it takes to become a physician. They know all about medical school, residency, what that looks like. Or some people, they'll say, oh yeah, I've seen Grey's Anatomy, so I kind of know what residency is. And then some people, they don't know. And people might just assume, oh, medical school is probably, it's just like what my undergraduate degree was, but harder. And don't realize medical school, the first 2 years is a lot of intense coursework, but the second 2 years is pretty much all rotations. And so you're traveling around and, going to different hospitals and clinics of all different specialties and doing work while you're still doing some studying and tests. Yeah. And then residency and so on. And with the dissertation or with a PhD, maybe there are people who, for whatever reason, just think it's like a master's degree, but just even harder. Yeah. Where one of the main differentiators is that it's very project based, for a huge dissertation research of original research that you're working on for years. So whether you have a little bit of coursework, like you mentioned in US PhDs, or maybe you have to do a little bit, like a 1 year if you're in the UK, the main goal is you're writing a huge 80,000 word plus dissertation paper, doing unique contribution to the field. And that's the primary goal.
Yeah, exactly. So
I want to talk about, I think, the unique relationship that you have with your PhD supervisor.
Yeah.
And I think we've already talked about the importance that people play in our lives. And many of us listening or watching this episode, we have a special relationship with an elementary teacher or a coach, and we know that impact can make. But I think there's something still unique about that PhD supervisor. I wonder if you can compare the difference between, let's say, a master's degree professor versus that PhD supervisor to PhD student relationship. What does that look like? Because I imagine it's just different given the nature of a class versus that project over years.
Well, no, it's very true. So, I mean, often with your professors at the master's level, you are mostly within a class-professor relationship. Of course, if you're writing papers and then maybe a thesis, you might go a little bit deeper within that relationship. But at the PhD level, at least in the UK, of course, so you're writing for 3, maybe 4 years, and your work is to write, complete a certain amount of that work, and then send it to your advisor, who will read it, tear it apart, will tell you why this argumentation is not working or why it is working, give you their insights, and then you meet and you discuss. And it becomes a very mentor to student relationship. And it just gets deeper and deeper as the years go on and as the research goes on. And students sometimes have a good, how do I want to say it, a good experience with their advisors, and sometimes they don't. Praise the Lord, in my experience, and in my wife, she also did a PhD at Aberdeen at the same time, working with Professor John Swinton. We just loved our advisors. I mean, I would not trade it for anything. I absolutely loved working with Professor Thiemeyer. She's brilliant. She's fun to work with. She's exceptional at what she does, and I know anyone in the field would say nothing less. I mean, she's just fantastic, and I liked it just because it really brings your writing to another level, because as you are submitting your work, that work is just getting edited, and you're getting pushback on your ideas, and you have to make a decision. I'm either going to submit to this pushback, or I'm not going to submit to this pushback, right? And so that sort of mentor to student relationship, you really begin to learn how to think well and to write well with someone who is very published and experienced in the field. I mean, again, speaking from the UK perspective, this could be true of the US as well. And it's that mentoring relationship that really brings you as a student to the higher level of scholar, and brings with it the ability to sift through ideas and to put it down on paper. And Professor Thiemeyer, she was great about this, because at the very beginning, she said, look, we can sit here and we can talk theology and Bible, and we love doing that, and we could do it, till we're blue in the face. But the bottom line is this: until you sit down and actually put it on paper, none of this matters, right? And so it's that sort of discipline that you have to have as the student to go sit down and write, and not get up and go walk around the beautiful university in which you are working for 3/4 of the day, and then just write for an hour. No, you've got to be very disciplined to do it, get your work submitted, and to get that feedback. So that relationship by the end is a good one. That's why, overseas, especially in the German tradition, but it's worked its way out, obviously, into the Western traditions as well. You'll say your Dr. Vater, your Dr. Father, right? Or your Dr. Mutter, in this case, like what I had with Professor Thiemeyer. And so that relationship becomes a very deep relationship. Different, I think, with the master's professors, obviously, because of the time. You're just spending a lot of time and a lot of discussion about your ideas, how you think, and how you write. But I tell you, there comes a moment, at least this was my experience. There comes a moment in that PhD process. It was true as well at Hebrew University. My writing by the end of it was vastly different than when I had come in. But at the PhD level, I just noticed 7 months in a radical difference in my writing and the research. And I can only thank Professor Tiemeyer for that, because I learned from her, was sifting through a lot of her own articles, how she would use footnotes, how she would make her own argumentations, and trying to just learn from that. Plus all the other scholars and research that you're going through, you start to realize, okay, I'm having a really long, really deep conversation with people who are dead, right? They've left their ideas to us through writing, people who are still alive. And the person stewarding that is my PhD advisor. And it's a fantastic experience. I would trade it for nothing. And I've told you that, right? So I would trade that sort of experience for nothing. So
I can attest to his writing ability. I remember first texting Nathan and I was blown away. I mean, even the way that he sends text messages, these words are just phenomenal.
It's kind of a curse, because you don't want to write anything unless it's good enough to go out there, I guess. So,
I'll text him some random, let's say random like Bible related question, and he'll send a response back. And I'm like, this feels like I just read a paragraph from a PhD dissertation, and you just whipped this up together. Like, in line at the grocery store or something. My goodness. The process you describe, I feel I'm getting vibes of a forge master, an old school apprenticeship, when you have such a tight knit relationship with someone who is encouraging you and challenging you to grow in a skill. And I think that's such a special relationship, and having someone that goes with you for such a long, involved process. That's really special, special.
Yeah.
So you kind of alluded to this with how it changes your writing. I wanted to ask maybe you've already kind of answered this, but when you think about the everything from the process to the product, the journey to the destination that a PhD takes you through, can you talk about how does that change you? How does that impact your thinking, your communicating, your researching, just you as a person? Because I know you walked away with more than, I say, just one book, as if it wasn't a big deal. Like, obviously you walked away with a book that you published, but there's more than just that you walked away with. Can you speak to that part?
Yeah. It's my wife and I talk about this a lot. When you have a PhD, it changes everything, because suddenly you're thinking critically at levels that you weren't thinking at before you did it. And that's what I've told students who want to go on and do a PhD, that this is what you get when you come out of it. You have levels of ability to think that were unattainable prior to doing the PhD. I'll go even a bit more specific with regard to the Hebrew Bible, right? With regard to biblical interpretation, because this is what my PhD is in. It's the reason why I ever went this direction was after doing theology, you realize, okay, well, all these theologians are just reading the Bible. So why wouldn't we all just become biblical scholars then, so that we can actually interpret the text correctly, right? Or you're reading Jesus and the apostles, you're reading the New Testament, and you're thinking, okay, they're just thinking on the Hebrew Bible, but I don't know anything about the ancient Near East or the Hebrew Bible, so I've got to go back even further to figure out what's going on here. And so I think for the PhD, what it does is, for reading the text, is it provides a level of ability to sift quickly through all of the various points behind the text. You got the text, you got the history, the culture, the religious traditions that might be impacting the ideas that are coming through. It gives you that ability to sift through all of that quickly, and moreover, to know where to find it. And I think that is I love that as a professor and a teacher here at ORU. I love it when my students I'm teaching a seminar in theological research for the undergraduate students. And so I have them in the library a lot right now, just sitting down. They just have to write an 8 to 12 page paper, but I want them to sit down, be near the books, and I want them to begin to learn. You need to go find this information, because once you have that tool, and a lot of these students want to go into ministry, but it's no different in ministry. You've still got to know how to find the information, how to be able to sift through it. So I want them to have that. And I just love it when the light bulbs sort of come on and like, okay, this is how you do this. You have to go to the shelves. You've got to find these books. You got to find these commentaries, these journal articles. And this will help me to understand the text, which is really important for what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, to understand the text rightly and better. So as I've said to other students, as I know I've said it to you, the PhD is an arduous journey. You're not going to come out on the other side necessarily making a lot of money. You may not even get a job in the field, as I know we may talk about a little bit later, but you do come out with the ability to read the text better than when you came in. Or whatever discipline you're in, that's going to be true for whatever practical elements that may work out. So
that's really good. You know, I saw a thread of someone who likes to make complex ideas simple through images on Facebook. And I think I sent this to you a number of months ago. And it was a beautiful picture, a series of pictures of someone who was mining and mining in the ground for resources. And he talked about how culturally he feels like in the culture that he's a part of, there's a huge value that's put on broad, shallow content, which, again, there's a place for that.
Yeah.
But he feels like because of the different social media platforms that have taken deep root in society recently, we have valued less and less deep research. And he does a great job talking about the journey and the difficulty that this takes, because the deeper you go, the fewer guides you have, the less familiarity, because you're going to places that not many people go to.
Yeah.
But and it takes longer. The ground gets harder the farther you dig down into the ground. Even if it rained recently, there's a point where you dig so deep that doesn't matter if the ground's been soaking for a week. There's no moisture down there, and you're working hard. You're going deep, but that's often where you find, by the way, treasure. It's where you find the treasure.
Oh yeah, totally.
So I think it's great.
Yeah.
And we talk about this a lot because I don't have a PhD yet. And, we talk about this, if this is a journey I want to take on or not. Mm-hmm. Real quickly, though, I do want to hit on, I know this episode's about PhD, but I want to attest that what you're doing for your students in seminar and theological research, I know I experienced that in my master's degree. Before I had a communication undergraduate degree, and I was a pastor at a church. I was a kids pastor at a large church and writing curriculum for kids churches. And I can tell you that I loved the team I was on. We did phenomenal work. Absolutely loved it. I will also say, though, there are resources I did not know existed until I actually got a degree in biblical studies, a master's degree there. And like you said, even if some of your students, they're not going to go on to academia, there are resources that they're simply not popular in church realms. And and I think that I'll just say this as a former curriculum writer and a former kids pastor, I think there are certain resources I wish I knew about that I think would have helped us to be even more holistic in the way that we teach. Yeah. So, and how do we learn those things? It's you always learn from someone who's a little bit beyond you, right? Yeah. If you've only taken algebra, you probably can't teach algebra. But once you've gone on a couple classes beyond algebra, right, then that's when you can really teach it. So that's why it matters that we have people who keep pursuing the PhD level. They're going to go the farthest lengths that are possible. And at some point, they're also going to bring back knowledge for the rest of us.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. I mean, I think that you're absolutely right about that. And especially for my ministry students, I really try to emphasize, I want them to know this really matters. Like, you are going to be out there telling people ideas regarding the text and regarding theology, and it matters for their lives, and it matters for the sheep that are under them. And I'll tell you, I've sit in many sermons, and I sit there with the knowledge, and I think, okay, that's just not good way to go the direction you're going with that. And never judgmental, and it's been years of that journey. I mean, since Hebrew University. And then of course for myself, I mean, I've been in a conversation with a dear friend of mine that I've had for a long time. And then another conversation with a dear friend of mine from Aberdeen who did a PhD in New Testament studies regarding one verse, John 10:35. And that conversation has had me on a little research journey just for the last 2.5 weeks, but I found some things where I'm like, okay, hey, never read this text in this light, and this suddenly changes some things for me. So this is the point, that it never ends, the research. So if you're going to go into ministry, or if you're going to be involved with teaching the biblical text, you've got to have the training and the degrees. And one thing I didn't say with the supervisory role, and this is important, I think I kind of talked about it with submitting or not submitting. This is the difference between those out there in ministry who've never done degrees at these levels or never done degrees in general, is you still have to learn the ability to submit to those who are over you in the stewarding of your ideas. Whether those over you are right or wrong, you've got to learn as the one who is stewarding knowledge to learn that submission. Because it helps you as you're moving forward then on your own in research to say, okay, what sort of pushback am I going to get by saying what I'm about to say in writing? You got to be able to step back and see arguments that are going to come back at you, and you've then got to determine whether you're going to submit or not submit to those potential arguments that may come toward you. So that becomes very important in the PhD supervisory role, and it can make or break a student actually. So
that is a great point. I'm so glad you made that. I relate to that on a leadership level, where I was very grateful to have worked at a church that had phenomenal leadership, and they talked about the same thing you're saying. Yeah. And within the more intellectual realm, I think we all have known someone at some point who is an intellectual rogue vigilante, and they, I think, teeter on arrogance because they feel like they're the ones who have the secret code, the secret knowledge, because they're so smart and they've read so much, but they don't let anyone else influence them. Right. And they are highly sensitive to any criticism of their ideas. They may even lash out. And this can often be the product of someone who's never gone through the process of submission, as you say, and being able to be led by someone. This is why I think many people get advice, even if you think you want to leave, even as a young person, I want to start my business right away. I want to start a church right away. I just want to go and influence everybody right away. Not saying it's wrong. I'm not trying to say it's wrong to do that, but there's a reason why there's an old adage of wisdom that before you lead your own thing, serve someone else. Right. And I hear what you're saying is intellectually, we have that same thing.
That's right.
And even though technology now lets you, it doesn't matter what your background is, if you're a good enough communicator and you have good enough ideas, you can get in front of a phone and you can communicate information. That's and right. I'm not saying this is bad, by the way. I mean, we're doing this.
Right.
But
as part of our calling, right? Yeah.
As part of our calling.
So. Right.
And just, so yeah, I would second and just say, hey, to people out there who, you know, especially those who are in ministry or those teaching, following your calling, don't listen to that voice of pride that feels like you have to have all the information yourself.
Yeah.
And there are people who want to help. And on the academic side, it's the same thing. You know, this is why in my classes, I have a lot of guest speakers who are, you know, I teach, you know, different classes, but I also like help my students with life. And so I bring in guest speakers who are business professionals, people who are counselors, business owners, life coaches, financial experts, because again, we don't have all the information we need to help people grow.
That's right.
So, okay. So something I'm really curious about is what's the average day or week look like for a PhD student? I love seeing a day in the life type of videos. So I bet people would be interested in seeing what does an average day or week look like for a PhD student.
So in the UK, it was wonderful. I know Professor Tiemeyer had several classes that she offered. So I would go be a part of those courses. And we had undergrad students, graduate students, and then she'd had a few PhD students come. And that was a lot of fun. We were reading Maimonides in Hebrew and translating for the other students on just Jewish literature and reading reading about those texts and all of that. So that was part of it. You could, in the UK at the University of Aberdeen, you could be part of any of the seminars that were going on within Divinity. Now, Divinity has a really tight program, or I should say tight community, very close community. All the professors in Divinity were fantastic. And you could be a part of seminars, let's say in Christian ethics. Let's say Stanley Hauerwas shows up, or Professor Hauerwas or Professor Brian Brock is giving a lecture or a class. He was giving a class in ethics on Genesis. I loved being a part of that. So depending on where you are, what year you're in, and your writing and your research, you could be part of as many seminars as you wanted to, but you got to be careful, right? Because you're really there to write your PhD and to get it done. So, excuse me. So, as far as the writing process, really, it was on you. Professor Tiamar was very good. She goes, you need to treat this like a job. You need to be able to take your breaks. You need to be able to take vacation time. She goes, she made a funny quip, I think, that, of course, with us Americans, we don't really take vacation, right? We're just so ready just to work. But very true in the UK, there's more vacation. Even in Israel, it was great. There was a holiday like every other week, right? So you were taking off, it seemed. But in any case, that became very helpful and instructive. So I treated it like a job. I'd show up at 8, or when we were able to get there in the morning. My wife and I lived in an apartment very close to the university. We'd walk together to the university. We even shared an office, which was great.
Fun.
We shared an office together. So we would just write and then do our lunch and then write till the evening. And then we would go back and, do the evening stuff and do it again the next day. And what was interesting about that is that when you're writing a PhD, if you're writing anything of any kind, some days you get a lot written. Some days you maybe get a sentence written or just a paragraph, or you spend all day on one footnote, for example, sifting through the research, or you've got to go to the library and pick up those books that you ordered from the store, from the annex, because it's not in the library, or it's such an old text you can't take it out of the library, so you got to go put it on the pillow and take the pictures that you need of the particular pages that you're looking for. So it just depends on the day. There's a lot of sitting down and writing, or there's a lot of getting up and going and having discussions with other students in the community, we had Hebrew Bible Seminar, which I absolutely loved. Hebrew Bible Seminar with Professor Schopper, and we would just sit down and read the Hebrew text together, and that was a lot of fun. We were required as students to be at that, but requirement or no requirement, I would have been there. I absolutely loved doing that. So much fun. And then, of course, you had that aspect, and then you just keep working. And Professor Tiamar was right. If you just treat it as a job to sit down and write, within that system especially, I was at least 75,000 words over, I think, what was required of the 100,000 max, 110,000 max. So I had to cut that thing way back. So anyways, that was pretty much the day. It's your day. You've got to be disciplined, sit down and write and do the work. But if you're disciplined, you'll get it done. And if you put your butt in the chair and just do the work, it's going to be okay, right?
You are a machine. People need to know this about you. I mean, you're so kind and positive, right? People maybe don't understand how you are an intellectual machine. The amount of stuff he reads, with teaching, with writing, researching. To imagine again, I mean, a lot of PhDs, the minimum goal is 80,000 words, at least in what I've looked up recently. Mm-hmm. I don't know what your range had to be.
That was it, yeah, 80 to 100.
Okay, to be 75,000 words over, you're talking, this isn't just like, hey, a little too much icing on that cake, man. Like you show up and your thing is double. It's double the length.
It was the sitting down and writing. That was it, basically.
So thorough. I love it. What was your, maybe just a couple more questions. I could talk forever about this. This has been so fun, but at some point we have to end.
Yeah.
What would you say if you had to pick one part of the process that was your favorite? What was your favorite part?
It was towards the end. My favorite part, and when you're putting a book together, and of course, learning this from my supervisor, when you're putting a book together, you can do it in many ways. You could write, sort of in the logic of beginning to end. You could also write another chapter first towards the end, and then come back and write in the middle, or then to the beginning. So my favorite part, I remember Professor Tiamar, she's like, okay, Nathan, you could sit here for another 8 years and just keep doing exegesis. Like, I know that's what you could be doing. But I think it's time for you to move on and move to the history of research, which became my second chapter. And the history of research was looking at the various scholarship regarding the interpretation of the knowledge of good and evil. And I had already gone through a lot of that, obviously my master's program, and had been even up to that point, but knowing that I'm not touching this yet, I'm just trying to get the exegetical work. I want to know what the text says. I want to make sure I can make the argument from the text. So when she said that, I thought, okay, I'm just going to be done with the exegetical work. I'll put these chapters together and shift things around as I'm doing the editing here towards the end. But then to go to the library at the end of the PhD experience, so my ability to research is at the top level within that moment, at least, and just start pulling books and journal articles to get my history of research down. And I'll tell you what, that became my favorite chapter, I think. Well, maybe besides the ancient Near Eastern chapter that comes after that, but nonetheless, I loved, just after doing the exegetical work and the research, I just absolutely loved then going through the ideas of the scholars from the 1850s forward. And I'm like, okay, I see why you're saying that, but no, it's not going to work because of this exegetical thing over here. And then just sifting through it and having that conversation with those scholars, it was wonderful. And then putting that together, I don't know. It was my favorite part, I think, of the whole dissertation experience, besides getting to do this with my wife at the same time. So,
of course, I mean that is the
right.
icing on the cake, right there.
Yes,
Doing it with your wife, for sure.
Yeah, so
that's great. And then I have one last question. It's kind of a two-parter. I'm going to ask you a question to speak to two different types of people listening or watching. First one is, what would you say to people who are considering the idea of getting a PhD in Hebrew Bible or biblical studies?
Yeah. So here's what I would say. I would say, go for it. If you feel that this is part of your calling, if you feel that this is something that maybe you're not thinking on a vocational level or a calling level, it's just something that you really want to do. I would say that if you've had the training, and if you've had the mentors who have said to you, I think you can go on and you need to do this, or maybe you haven't and you know that you can, then you need to begin looking into the programs that you want to be a part of, or of which you want to be a part, or more importantly, with whom you want to work on the PhD. That becomes most important. I've told you that many times, right? That you need to look for the person with whom you really want to work and make the proposal. Because if that person says yes, then that's what you want. And of course, you want someone who is going to work with your topic very well. So that's the first thing I would say is just go for it. The second thing I would say is, but be prepared that the Hebrew Bible biblical studies realm, New Testament as well, is saturated with PhDs at the moment, and jobs are extremely difficult to find. So I would say that if your vision and your heart is ultimately a vocational one, i.e. a job at the end, not a vocational, I should say, just a job at the end, then you need to be prepared, I think, for a difficult journey. Not for everyone. Some people are going to be able to jump right in. They're going to find that job, or they had one previously and they're still in it and they're getting their PhD, and then they're still going to be in it and doing more after they have the PhD. But I think if you can step back from the job prospects, knowing that the PhD, like any educational thing, which is why education is still important, why academia is so important, is that it will change you as a person. It will transform you as a thinker and a writer, and that is what matters. So for biblical studies, absolutely. And I would say after you have your PhD, keep your options open. There are many other avenues just besides academia where you can go with your PhDs and where you can take it. Mati and Natan, we are trying to do it through a podcast, right? Like we know that this is an avenue that we can try to actually use our expertise in our work, just besides academia alone. So the point being, I would say go for it, but know that the journey may not end up where you want it to end up, as I've seen, but stay in it. Even those of you who have PhDs in biblical studies, you're still trying to get into academia, I'd say find avenues where you can use your trainings and your giftings outside of academia, but keep pushing forward and try to get those jobs as they come available. So that would be my advice. Begin to count the cost, but if you can bear the cost, go for it.
That's really good. Really good.
Yeah.
One last question I want to ask. This is to a totally different audience member. And what would you say to the person who they take the study of Scripture very seriously, and maybe they are also someone who teaches others in some capacity, whether that's as a pastor, small group leader, or whatever, but they're naturally skeptical of PhD Bible scholars for who knows what reason, whether an experience they had with a professor who they thought was just trying to, I don't know, tear down their faith, or maybe they have no experience with PhD people, but they just, I don't know, academia feels like an ivory tower thing. Do you have any thoughts that you would say to that person?
Yeah. I mean, I think what I would say is this, that I'm not suggesting that PhDs are correct in everything they write or say. That's why there is so much debate going on within academia. That's why we're still writing journal articles and publishing books. We're actually telling other scholars, no, we don't think that this idea is correct, or we like this one, or we don't like this one. So what I would say is this. PhDs aren't out there to try to destroy your faith. Maybe some have those motives. I think there are some who don't like the mixing of academia and religious traditions of any kind, especially sometimes on the evangelical Christian side. That seems to be the case in different places within academia. But I would say that really what you would be joining in is a conversation, right? You're joining in a very high-level conversation about the biblical text, of which, if you're in ministry, you need to be reading and understanding at the highest levels. And so what I would say is be diverse in your reading. Read those that do disagree with you. Read those that are suggesting that your faith is not reasonable, shouldn't be adhered to, this side of the Enlightenment or anything like that. Read those works so you know what they're saying, so that you can give a defense then of why you believe what you believe. I don't know. For me, I was raised Roman Catholic and then stepped into the Pentecostal evangelical world. And so for me, I don't know if it's Roman Catholicism where it's just been sort of a trajectory of, I just like debate and I enjoy discussing all of these things because it's a fun discussion. Whether I agree with it or not, I want to have the discussion about the text and about what a good reading of the text and even a faithful reading of the text would be. So I would say there are moments where you need to press into those with whom you do agree, who are scholars and PhDs, learn the argumentation, learn why they're saying what they say, so that you can make your defense, because truth does matter and we do need to have a defense of truth, but also be willing to read all the other works as well and join in on the conversation. That in any case is what it means to be liberally minded, right? To consider ideas, but not necessarily to accept all ideas, right? But to willing to bring ideas to the table and let those ideas be there and judge them according to whether they have merit or do not have merit. That seems to be the main thing. But especially to that other crowd, I would say, or to our other listeners, I would say this though, especially those who are dealing with the text and teaching the church. Don't be afraid to pick up those PhD works, those commentaries, and try to understand what they are saying. The scholars, their goal is to make it easy, even if you haven't had the training, for example, in the languages, to get through the languages so that you can get a deeper understanding of what the text says. And of course, I know many pastors do this anyways, and many ministers and preachers. But I do hear things, and I know you two do, you as well, Mati, in your understanding of Hebrew at this point. You hear things, Hebrew being used. I often hear it, and I'm like, no, that's not correct, but I don't know why it's important at this point, or not being pronounced correctly, or whatever it is. It's like, okay, for some reason, the person teaching at the moment feels that this is going to make their point more authoritative, when in fact, when another authority is there, it makes it less. And so that's my point, is I think don't be afraid to be where you are in your elements of teaching and in your knowledge base, to be humble and to say, yes, these other authorities, these other people, yes, people who believe what I believe, have asked very serious questions about the text, and they've given very reasonable, very logical, very important answers to the very arguments that are pressing in to suggest that what you're reading is not true, or should not be read that way.
Phenomenal. Such great wisdom. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today. I think a lot of people get a lot of value out of this, and I'm so glad to have you as permanent co-host for this. And you've been such a great impact on my life and my research and how I learn. We'll see if I do a PhD or not, still in the middle of that decision, but I've been so grateful to many people who do have a PhD. And whether or not you have a PhD or you want one as a listener, either way, thank you for joining us. And we hope that our podcast adds value to you with your personal and professional goals. So thanks for joining us for this episode today, and we'll see you in the next one.